At a small-town veteran ceremony in Texas, Keanu Reeves shakes hands with a quiet stranger, only to discover the man once saved his father's life in Vietnam and never told a soul. What Keanu does next is something no one, not even the hero himself, ever saw coming. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The envelope wasn't marked urgent, and it wasn't from an agent or a producer. It came quietly, buried beneath the usual fan letters and foundation updates. Keanu Reeves opened it on a quiet morning, sipping black coffee in his kitchen overlooking the hills. The paper was plain, no official letterhead, just a heartfelt invitation from a small military nonprofit based in a quiet Texas town called Belleville. They were hosting a veterans honor ceremony. Nothing fancy, no red carpet, no media, just a gathering to recognize soldiers who had been overlooked, whose service was buried under decades of silence. The letter was signed by a woman named Claire, the daughter of a Vietnam veteran. "We know you support a lot behind the scenes. If you ever wanted to attend something small, where it's not about you but about them, you'd be welcome." That line stayed with him. Keanu didn't owe the event anything. He didn't know anyone in Belleville. But the humility of it all, the quiet tone, the absence of expectation, struck something deep. He made the call that same afternoon. 3 days later, he landed at a modest airstrip just outside of town. No press, no entourage, just one assistant and a truck waiting to take him to the community center where the ceremony was being held. The town was sleepy, with dusty roads, American flags waving in spring sunlight, and a palpable stillness. Outside the center, a group of aging veterans stood in quiet clusters, some with canes, some in wheelchairs, others standing tall but hollow-eyed. Most wore old dress uniforms or jackets patched with service insignias, the kind of men whose names had long faded from headlines, but whose memories never quite left the battlefield. Keanu walked in unnoticed at first, dressed in jeans and a black shirt, his presence understated. He signed the guest book without using his last name. As the folding chairs began to fill, he took a seat toward the back, content to listen, to witness. That's when he saw him. An older man sat by the far wall, apart from the rows of chairs. He wasn't mingling, he wasn't looking for attention, just sitting quietly, shoulders squared, back straight. In his hands was a worn, creased photograph, clutched like something sacred. Keanu watched the man for a moment, unable to look away. His hair was silver, cropped short. His uniform jacket was faded but pressed, his boots well-worn. But it was his eyes that stopped Keanu cold. Not their color, but the way they held pain without asking anyone to notice. On the chair beside him rested a small note card with the name, Tony Herrera. He had no family with him, no one sitting near. Just him, the photo, and a silence that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Keanu leaned in to whisper to his assistant, "Find out who he is." Keanu's assistant, Lauren, returned 10 minutes later with a quiet nod. She spoke softly so as not to disturb the respectful silence filling the room. "His name is Tony Herrera," she said, 74, served in Vietnam, Bronze Star recipient, but no public record of the citation. Apparently, he saved an entire patrol unit from an ambush back in '71. Never talked about it, not even to his wife, who passed a few years ago. Keanu's brows drew together. "And the photo?" Lauren glanced toward Tony, careful not to stare. "It's an old unit photo, that's all I could find. Locals say he comes to these events every year, always alone, never wants to speak, just shows up." That was enough for Keanu. During the ceremony, veterans were called one by one. Applause, nods, some tears. The room felt like it was stitched together by decades of silence and survival. When Tony's name was announced, he didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he stood. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Tony didn't say a word. He simply walked to the podium, placed the photo down in front of the microphone, and gave a small salute. Then he returned to his seat. No speech, no fuss. But something in that gesture felt more profound than any words. After the ceremony, as attendees began mingling, Keanu made his way toward him. He waited for a respectful moment, then sat in the empty chair beside him. Tony looked over, clearly surprised, not by recognition. Keanu could tell he wasn't the type to follow Hollywood, but by the quiet sincerity of the approach. "You served in Vietnam?" Keanu asked, gently. Tony gave a small nod. 50 years ago, feels like yesterday, and also like another life. Keanu glanced at the photo in his lap. "That your unit?" Tony's voice was rough but steady. "Yeah, not all of them made it home." Keanu studied the faces in the picture. Some were smiling, some looked impossibly young, and one, in the second row, made his heart skip. He looked again, closer this time. That face, that jawline, those eyes. It couldn't be. He pointed. "This man here, second row, left side. Do you know his name?" Tony furrowed his brow. "That's David Reeves, sergeant, good man. Took a bullet for one of his guys, lived, but barely." Keanu's throat tightened. That was his father's name. He hadn't seen that version of his father, young, full of life, in any photo. But now here he was, frozen in black and white, standing beside Tony Herrera. Keanu didn't speak, not yet. Tony turned to him, noticing the sudden shift in his expression. "You all right, son?" Keanu nodded slowly, eyes still on the photo. "I think you saved someone I knew," he said, voice just above a whisper. And for the first time, Tony Herrera blinked, as if something long buried was beginning to stir. The two men sat in silence for a while, the photo resting between them like a quiet bridge across time. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled golden light across the modest town square, catching the edges of the American flag fluttering above the VFW hall. People lingered around the refreshment tables, laughing softly, sipping from plastic cups. But Keanu's focus never left Tony. "I was 9 when my dad died," Keanu finally said. "I didn't know much about his time in the military. He didn't talk about it, and I never saw that photo before today." Tony looked at him carefully, his jaw tightening. "You're Reeves's boy?" Keanu nodded. Tony exhaled, a sound that held decades. "Your old man?" He was stubborn, brave as hell, but stubborn. He paused, then tapped the edge of the photo with one calloused finger. "There was a night," Tony said. "The jungle was burning. We were ambushed outside Quang Tri. Your dad got pinned behind a collapsed ridge with 2 other guys. He was losing blood fast." Tony's voice cracked just slightly. "I crawled through a ditch under fire, pulled him out, took shrapnel to the shoulder doing it. He didn't say a word, just looked at me, like he was saying goodbye." Keanu didn't interrupt. Tony's gaze drifted across the courtyard. "Afterward, I never told anyone, didn't think it mattered. What mattered was getting them all home." Keanu's throat tightened. It mattered. Tony gave a small smile, one corner of his weathered face lifting. "Maybe. But back then, you didn't do it for medals or speeches. You did it because it was right." A silence settled between them, rich and respectful. Then Tony added, almost as an afterthought, "I always wondered what happened to him." "Made it home," Keanu said. "But the war never really left him." Tony nodded solemnly. A voice crackled through a portable speaker nearby, announcing the start of the group photo. Veterans began rising from their chairs, slowly assembling in front of the stage. Keanu stood with them, but turned to Tony before leaving. "Do you mind if I get a copy of that photo?" he asked. "I'd like to remember him like this." Tony looked down at the image in his hands. Then, without a word, he lifted the picture and handed it to Keanu. "I think it's time someone else carried it," he said. Keanu held the photo carefully, like it might break. As they walked toward the gathering crowd, Keanu knew something had shifted. This trip wasn't just about honoring others. It had quietly become something far more personal, something unfinished, something that needed to be made right. After the ceremony concluded and most of the folding chairs had been stacked, Keanu lingered beneath a shade tree at the edge of the small-town Veterans Park. The air was warm, dry, and carried the distant scent of grilled barbecue and cut grass. Volunteers chatted quietly nearby, but Keanu's attention was elsewhere. He kept glancing toward the man seated alone on the far bench. Older, wiry, with silver-white hair pulled back into a short ponytail and a pair of worn, dusty boots that looked older than some of the attending Marines. Balanced carefully in the man's lap was a creased photo protected in a plastic sleeve. The man hadn't moved much since the closing prayer. His eyes stayed down, gently scanning that photo over and over again, like it was his only connection to the world. Keanu felt drawn, not out of curiosity, but something deeper, an unspoken recognition in the man's silence. He quietly approached, making sure his steps weren't loud or intrusive. "Mind if I sit?" Keanu asked softly. The man looked up, his weathered face marked by time and pain, but his eyes still sharp. He nodded once, offering the kind of quiet welcome you only learn in war. "Name's Tony," he said after a pause. "Tony Herrera." Keanu nodded back. "Keanu." "I know," Tony replied, with the faintest grin. There was no awe or star-struck energy in his voice, just a mutual respect exchanged between men who understood things that rarely made headlines. Keanu gestured to the photo. "May I?" Tony handed it over gently, as if it were glass. In the faded image were 12 young soldiers in full gear, lined up against a jungle backdrop. 8 were circled in red ink. One corner of the photo had been burned, barely holding together. Tony's finger hovered over the ink. "Those are the ones who made it out. I just help." He didn't say more. His voice held no bravado, only an ache that spoke volumes. Keanu held the photo with both hands, absorbing its weight. Not just the paper, but the lives behind it. Keanu passed the photo back with care, like returning something sacred. For a few moments, neither man spoke. The wind moved softly through the trees above, rustling the leaves like whispers from a different time. Tony finally broke the silence. "We were just kids," he said, looking out across the empty field. 19, 20, most of us didn't even know how to shave right. Keanu nodded, listening. "I was the oldest in the group. 22. They called me Grandpa," Tony chuckled quietly. "We were deep in Quang Tri. Radio went dead, no backup. And the jungle? It doesn't care who you are." He looked down at his hands. They trembled slightly. Not from age alone. Home night, we got ambushed. I heard the first round before the scream. I crawled out, pulled 2 guys back into the trees, used my last grenade to cover our exit. Thought that was the end for me. But we made it. 8 of us out of 15. Keanu's brow furrowed. "That photo, it's all you have from that day?" Tony nodded. "I lost my rucksack on the way out. Lost a lot more than that, too." There was no bitterness in his tone, only memory. They gave everyone else something. Commendations, stripes, even stateside interviews for a few. But me? Nothing. I didn't care then. Figured it was enough just being alive. But sometimes, it feels like it never even happened. Keanu sat quietly, moved by the quiet strength in Tony's voice. No self-pity, no resentment. Just a man who had done something extraordinary and walked away like it was just his job. "I don't talk about it much," Tony said. "My wife used to say it lived in my bones more than my words." Keanu glanced back at the photo again. "Do they know? The guys who made it?" Tony smiled faintly. "A couple still write. One passed last year, another one runs a bait shop in Louisiana, but I don't think any of them knew the full picture. I didn't want the spotlight." "But you were the reason they made it," Keanu said softly. Tony shrugged. "That's not what matters. What matters is they did." The humility in his words landed deep. Keanu felt it, something unspoken rising inside him. He knew in that moment this wasn't a chance encounter. It was a story, waiting to be honored. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You didn't want the spotlight, but I think the world needs to hear your story." Tony shook his head gently. The world's moved on. People are busy trying to keep their own lights on. And that's okay. We didn't fight to be remembered. We fought so others could forget the worst of it. The simplicity of that statement stunned Keanu. I never told my daughter any of this, Tony continued. She thinks I was just a supply driver. I let her believe it. Figured it'd keep her proud without giving her the nightmares. Keanu sat with that for a moment. His own past with his father flickered through his mind, how silence could sometimes build bridges, but more often left holes that never fully closed. Tony stood slowly, easing up from the bench with the help of his cane. It's not that I'm ashamed. I just never wanted anyone to look at me different. The real heroes, some of them never came home. Keanu rose with him. That may be true, but some heroes come home and disappear quietly. That doesn't make them any less heroic. Tony smiled. You sound like my wife. She used to say, just because you won't hang your medal doesn't mean you didn't earn it. Did you ever apply for one? Keanu asked gently. Tony shook his head. Didn't seem right. Would have felt like asking for a pat on the back for doing what needed to be done. Besides, who'd believe me now? Keanu looked back at the photo again. I would. They stood there for a beat, two men from two different worlds, joined by something that didn't need words. Thank you for sitting with me, Tony said finally, offering his hand. Keanu shook it firmly. The honor's mine. As Tony walked slowly back toward the crowd, Keanu stayed behind. Something had shifted. This wasn't just a story of a forgotten veteran. It was something personal, something unfinished. He looked back at the photo Tony had shown him, one face catching his eye more than the others. A young soldier, sharp jaw, confident grin, circled in red. Keanu's breath caught. He'd seen that face before. He'd seen it in the faded photographs tucked away in a drawer for years. His father, Gerard Reeves. The sun was beginning to fall behind the trees, stretching long amber shadows across the gravel parking lot outside the Veterans Hall. The chatter from inside had faded, leaving behind the soft clink of folding chairs and coffee cups. On a weathered bench near the edge of the lot, Keanu and Tony sat side by side. The moment was quiet, unhurried. Between them sat a folded program from the ceremony and Tony's worn photo, resting like a relic of something sacred. Keanu turned slightly toward him. That picture, he said gently. Those men, what happened? Tony exhaled slowly, staring into the horizon. It was March of '69. Mekong Delta. We were 12 strong, dropped in for a 5-day recon. It should have been quiet. He paused as if deciding whether to go on. Then he did. We were ambushed. Fire came from the trees, the brush, the air, claymores, AKs, screaming. We hit the ground fast, but we were trapped. 5 of our boys were down within the first 2 minutes. Keanu leaned in, expression tight with focus. I didn't think. I just moved. Sergeant Mitchell was closest. Shot in the leg. I grabbed him, threw him over my shoulder, and ran. Found a small trench line, dropped him there. Then went back. You went back? Keanu whispered. Tony nodded. Again and again. 3 more times. The bullets never stopped. But I couldn't leave them. Johnson, Perez, Lopez, then Reeves. Keanu froze. Tony didn't notice. His gaze had drifted to the photo now in his hands. That kid, Reeves. He had shrapnel in his shoulder, blood everywhere. But he kept pushing others behind cover, kept saying, "Get him out! Don't stop!" I carried him last. He was fading. A lump grew in Keanu's throat. Tony chuckled sadly. I was the oldest, 18, barely more than a kid myself, but that day, I felt 100 years old. Did you file a report? Keanu asked, his voice barely audible. No, I didn't know the rules. Didn't care. I was tired of forms. Tired of watching names disappear into body bags. I just wanted to save who I could. He traced the edges of the photo with a finger. They lived, 5 of them. I still see their faces sometimes. I remember how they laughed, even when they were scared. Keanu sat back, shaken. His heart raced. His father, Gerard Reeves, had served in Vietnam but had rarely spoken of it. Could it really be him? Tony's voice broke into his thoughts. I never told anyone, never thought it mattered. Keanu looked him in the eye. It matters. It matters more than you'll ever know. Tony didn't answer, but the faintest flicker of peace passed across his weathered face. The next morning, Keanu couldn't stop thinking about Tony's story. He lay awake most of the night, replaying the man's quiet, matter-of-fact words about bodies, blood, running into gunfire, not once, but 5 times. And that name, Reeves. A soldier named Reeves, rescued last. Keanu's father had mentioned his time in Vietnam only once, during a rare, vulnerable night. He never went into detail, but Keanu remembered one thing clearly. If not for one man, I wouldn't have made it back. Keanu had assumed it was a medic, or maybe a commander, but now he wondered, had it been Tony? The coincidence was too strong to ignore. Later that day, Keanu sat in a small diner near the Veterans Center. He asked Tony if he wanted to grab breakfast. Tony obliged, wearing the same jacket from the day before. When they sat down, Keanu gently brought up the name. Do you remember the names of all the men you pulled out? Tony nodded slowly. Most of them, yeah. It's been a long time, but some names stay carved in the back of your mind. Keanu hesitated. Was one of them Gerard Reeves? Tony stopped mid-chew. His fork clinked softly on the plate. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he leaned back. Reeves, yeah. That's the one who kept pushing the others ahead. He was the last. Took a round to the side, but he never panicked. Called me a mule, Tony chuckled. Said, Mule, you better not drop me. I never did. Keanu blinked hard, trying to keep his voice steady. That was my father. Tony's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't speak right away. A quiet understanding passed between them. I never knew his first name, Tony said finally. We didn't have time for introductions out there, just instincts. Keanu reached across the table, resting a hand over Tony's. You saved my father's life. Without you, I wouldn't be here. Tony looked away, his throat working to swallow emotion he hadn't expected. I just did what any man would have done. But most men didn't, Keanu replied. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. For the rest of breakfast, they didn't speak much. Just shared the same table, the same coffee, the same space between 2 lifetimes. But in that silence, something passed between them. Something real. Respect. Gratitude. Maybe even healing. When they stood to leave, Keanu gripped Tony's hand firmly. I don't know what you believe in, he said, but I believe you deserve to be remembered, not just by those men, but by the world. Tony nodded slowly, then gave a soft smile. Then don't remember me loud, remember me right. And with that, he turned toward the door, the diner's bell ringing gently as it closed behind him. Keanu didn't go back to Los Angeles right away. Instead, he stayed in the quiet Texas town for 2 more days, attending small community gatherings and checking in at the Veterans Center, where Tony often spent his afternoons. Every time they crossed paths, Tony would nod in his humble way, never seeking attention, never bragging, just existing with the quiet strength of someone who had carried far more than his own weight for decades. But Keanu couldn't let it rest. That night, back at the small inn he'd rented, Keanu pulled out his laptop. He opened multiple tabs, searching military records, declassified Vietnam accounts, and newspaper clippings from 1969. He didn't find Tony Herrera's name in any official commendation list. Not once. There were brief mentions of a squad extraction near Da Nang and a general statement about 5 wounded soldiers returning due to unidentified assistance, but that was it. Nothing with Tony's name. Keanu leaned back in the chair, a lump forming in his throat. It didn't surprise him. Tony had said he never filed the paperwork. No fanfare, just did his job. But it wasn't just a job. It was a miracle. and the world had let it fade into obscurity. Keanu made a decision that night. He emailed his assistant, asking her to reach out to contacts at the Department of Veterans Affairs, several veteran advocacy nonprofits, and even the Pentagon. He wasn't seeking publicity. He didn't want a news story. What he wanted was justice, quiet, dignified justice. For a man who had carried 5 lives on his back through jungle fire and never once told the world. The next morning, Keanu stopped by the diner where they'd shared breakfast. Tony was already there, sipping coffee, reading a worn paperback. Keanu sat down. No need for pleasantries, just presence. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about what you told me, about what you did." Tony raised an eyebrow. "What about it? You never got a medal. No recognition. Why?" Tony shrugged. "That's not why I did it." "I know," Keanu said. "But you still should have gotten one." Tony took a sip of his coffee and looked out the window. "Medals are for memory. I don't need one to remember." "But what about the rest of us?" Keanu asked gently. "What if the world needs one? Not to praise you, but to remember men like you existed?" Tony didn't answer. The silence stretched long, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. Finally, Tony smiled. "If it helps someone else remember, then maybe it's worth it." Keanu nodded, already knowing what he was going to do. Not for applause, not for history books, but for one man, sitting quietly in a diner with a worn paperback and a war still lingering in his bones. A man who never asked to be honored, but who had more than earned it. Keanu sat alone in his hotel room, the warmth of the day's ceremony lingering in his chest. On the nightstand was the folded black and white photograph Tony had handed him. He hadn't planned to look at it again that night, but something about the quiet, broken only by the hum of the ceiling fan, made him reach for it. He turned on the bedside lamp and gently unfolded the worn image. 7 young men in uniform stood together beneath a thick canopy of jungle. Their faces were streaked with mud, and their helmets sat heavy over eyes too young to have seen what they had. But there was something powerful in their posture. Not pride, not victory, just survival. Tony had drawn a red circle around 5 of them. "The ones who made it," he'd said earlier. "I just helped." Keanu squinted at the writing beneath each face. Faded ink, handwritten in shaky letters, some names barely legible. He leaned closer, tracing the lines with his finger. There, just beneath the 3rd soldier from the left, was a name that made his breath catch. Keanu Reeves. His heart pounded. He stared at the name, reading it again and again. No middle initial, no rank, just G. Reeves. He stood abruptly, pulling open his travel bag and digging through a zippered pouch. Inside, carefully folded in a leather wallet, was a copy of his late father's dog tag. Gerard had carried it through Vietnam long before Keanu was born. It was one of the few things he'd left behind that felt like truth. Keanu unfolded it and held it beside the photo. Gerard Reeves, 101st Airborne. Blood type, O negative. His legs gave out slightly as he sat back on the edge of the bed. He hadn't expected this. Hadn't prepared to see his father's name on a photo from a man who barely spoke above a whisper. Images from childhood flooded back. His father in the garage, half drunk, half lucid, mumbling about the jungle, about one guy who ran through hell to get us out. He'd never given a name, just called him the crazy quiet one. Could it be? Keanu looked closer at the faces in the photo. One of them, near the center, had a faint resemblance. The angle wasn't perfect, but the jawline matched. The posture, the eyes, the kind of stare that carried too much weight behind it. A chill ran down his spine. Tony hadn't just saved any soldiers. He'd saved Gerard Reeves. And the man had no idea that the son of one of those soldiers had just sat beside him, listening to a story that rewrote his family's past. Keanu leaned back against the wall, silent, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion that left him stunned. He whispered the words out loud, barely audible to the empty room. "Who saved my father?" Keanu sat motionless for several minutes, still gripping the photo and dog tag in each hand. The quiet hum of the ceiling fan felt louder now, spinning above a room that had suddenly become sacred. What were the chances? What twist of fate had brought him to that small Texas town, to that quiet ceremony, to that empty chair beside Tony? The gravity of the realization settled in slowly. Tony hadn't just saved a nameless group of soldiers. He had saved Keanu's father. And in doing so, Tony had unknowingly shaped the life of a boy who would one day grow into the man sitting here now, trembling at the edges of revelation. Keanu rose and paced the room, unable to sit still. Memories of Gerard came back, not the dark ones, not the fights or the silence, but the few rare moments when the man had looked at him and said something kind, something almost human. He remembered once, when Keanu was 12, Gerard had taken him to a park. They'd sat on a bench and his father, eyes fixed on the horizon, told him softly, "There's a guy who once dragged me through mud and bullets. Didn't say much, just kept going. If I'm still breathing, it's because of him." Back then, Keanu thought it was just a war story, a drunken man clinging to the glory of his youth. But now the story had a face, a name, and a heartbeat. He walked over to the window, staring out into the stillness of the night. Down below, the streets of the sleepy Texas town were quiet. Somewhere in one of those modest houses, Tony was probably asleep, unaware of the storm he'd stirred. Keanu reached for his phone, tempted to call someone, his sister Kim maybe, but stopped. This wasn't something to speak about yet, not until he was sure. He picked up the photo again, studying the outline of each man. There was Gerard, circled in the back row, tall and thin. Standing beside him, Tony, younger than, but unmistakably the same man from the ceremony. The calm in his expression, even in the photo, was haunting. There was no bravado, just endurance. Keanu sat back down, slower this time, and stared at the photo for a long while. Finally, he whispered to the room, "I owe him everything. Not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as a son." Tomorrow he'd see Tony again. He needed to hear more, not just the mission, but the moments, the choices, the man behind the silence. And he needed to find a way to say thank you for something that had no words. The next morning, Keanu arrived early at the same modest cafe where he'd first seen Tony sipping weak coffee alone. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped in, sunlight casting a golden glow across the linoleum floor. A waitress behind the counter gave him a polite smile, then nodded toward a back booth. Tony was already there, same seat, same mug in hand, only today Keanu saw him differently. Not just as a veteran or a quiet soul, but as the reason he was alive. Indirectly, deeply, undeniably. Keanu approached, heart thudding, the photo clutched in his jacket pocket. "You don't mind company?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Tony looked up and nodded once. "Not at all." Keanu sat across from him and pulled out the photo. He laid it gently on the table, smoothing the edges with care. Tony's eyes fell on it, softening. "I looked again last night," Keanu said. "One of the names, Gerard Reeves. That was my father." Tony looked up slowly. His expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes flickered. A recognition buried under years of silence. "I remember Gerard," he said, voice quiet. "Tall kid. Smart mouth, always talking about cars. Took a hit in the side during the retreat. I carried him the last mile." Keanu swallowed hard, suddenly 10 years old again, remembering the way his dad had limped when it rained. "I used to talk about someone," Keanu said. "Said he owed his life to a man who didn't say much. A man who never asked for thanks." Tony looked away for a moment, toward the window. "I didn't know his name until after the medevac. Didn't think it mattered, I just didn't want to leave anyone behind." Keanu nodded, his throat tight. "You didn't just save a man, You saved everything that came after him. His son. This life. Mine." Tony blinked, uncomfortable with the weight of the gratitude. "I didn't do it for medals," he said, "or for memory. Just did what anyone would do." Keanu leaned forward, voice steady. "No, Tony, most people wouldn't, but you did. And I think it's time someone remembers that." Tony didn't respond right away. He reached for the photo and studied it for a long moment, fingertips brushing the faded ink around Gerard's name. The silence between them was full, not empty. Keanu let it stretch, knowing this wasn't a moment to rush. Finally, Tony folded the photo carefully and handed it back. "Keep it," he said. "You might want to show it to your kids someday." Keanu smiled faintly. "I will." And for the first time, Tony Herrera smiled back. Not the smile of a man brushing off attention, but of someone finally seen. A man no longer invisible. They sat for another hour. Two men linked by a moment neither could fully remember, but both would never forget. The old trunk in Keanu's home office hadn't been opened in years. It sat beneath a shelf of books and framed photos, untouched since his mother mailed it to him after Gerard's passing. That night, lit only by a desk lamp and a deep sense of urgency, Keanu gently unlatched the brass hinges. The scent of old paper and cedar filled the air. Inside were pieces of a man's history: Gerard Reeves' letters from Vietnam, faded Polaroids, a tarnished dog tag on a rusted chain. Keanu pulled out a worn stack of letters tied with red thread. He untied them carefully, scanning the first pages for anything, any sliver of memory that might connect the quiet man he'd met in Texas to the father he once knew. And then it came. Dated May 3, 1969, the letter read, "I got caught in the thick of it 2 days ago. Ambush near the ravine. Would have been done for, but a kid from Corpus Christi, Herrera, dragged me through mud and fire for hours. Never seen guts like that. Didn't ask for thanks. Just gave me water and kept moving. Told me, we all go home or none of us do." Keanu froze. His breath caught. Herrera. Tony Herrera? The same name etched under the faded black and white photo Tony had shared earlier that day. Keanu's heart pounded as he reached for another letter. The next one, dated months later, mentioned Herrera again, this time during a supply run gone wrong. Gerard's handwriting was uneven but filled with awe. That kid's made of something else. Doesn't care about medals, just does the right thing every single time. It was all lining up. Keanu sat back in the chair, overcome. The pieces weren't just connecting. They were forming something sacred. He whispered into the silence, "He saved you." And in some strange way, that meant Tony had saved him too. Keanu didn't sleep that night. The weight of what he'd uncovered pressed against his chest like a quiet storm. He sat at the kitchen table until sunrise, Gerard's letters spread around him like sacred artifacts. His coffee went cold. His thoughts never did. How many years had Tony lived without ever knowing that the man he carried through gunfire had gone home, had started a family, had raised a son who would one day sit across from him in a folding chair at a dusty Texas ceremony? Keanu ran a hand through his hair and opened his laptop. He searched military records, narrowing down battalion rosters, jungle ambush reports, any official documentation of the May 1969 rescue. But like Tony had said, there was no record, no press, no report filed, just the memory carried in a handful of letters, and the silence of a man too humble to speak about his own heroism. Keanu picked up Gerard's dog tag from the trunk. He held it in his hand for a long time. The metal was cold, but the name etched into it pulsed with warmth now. Because now it had context. It had a second name tied to it. Herrera. He needed to do something, but not for himself. Tony deserved to know. Not just that Keanu remembered, not just that his bravery mattered, but that the man he saved carried that moment until his final days. And that Keanu, his son, had now picked up that thread. Later that morning, Keanu called his assistant. "I need a list of every Department of Defense contact who handles medal submissions," he said softly, "and someone who can verify unit service records from Vietnam." Quietly. There was a pause on the other end, then a gentle, "Understood." Keanu hung up and turned back to the trunk. In the corner was a photo he hadn't seen before, Gerard holding baby Keanu, both laughing. He clutched it tighter than he meant to. This wasn't about correcting a clerical error. It was about closing a loop, about honor, and about finally putting into motion something Gerard Reeves had never been able to do. Thank the man who saved him. Not in memory, but in person. The next few days unfolded like a mission. Keanu flew back to Los Angeles but carried Tony's story with him every step of the way. In between shoots and meetings, he made calls to military liaisons, veteran organizations, historians, archivists, even a retired general who'd worked on recognition campaigns for forgotten heroes. Every conversation began the same way. "There's a man who never asked for praise, but without him, I wouldn't be here." At first, most were skeptical. Vietnam records were a mess, especially for small unit, undocumented rescues. But Keanu had Gerard's letters. He had names, timelines, and Tony's exact recounting of the terrain and the ambush. One retired sergeant, after reading a scan of a letter from Gerard, simply said, "Son, this isn't fiction. This happened." With that validation, Keanu pushed further. He submitted an application to the Department of the Army's Awards and Decorations branch, complete with sworn statements from Gerard's letters, service documentation, and a detailed recounting of the May 1969 ambush. He asked for no fanfare, no media, just justice. Meanwhile, he stayed in contact with Tony through small gestures, a postcard here, a phone call there, a book about old war correspondence left on Tony's doorstep. Never mentioning what he was working on, just enough to keep the bond warm. Then, late one Thursday afternoon, his assistant walked into Keanu's trailer with an envelope in hand. She didn't say anything, just handed it over. Keanu opened it slowly. Inside was a letter from the Department of the Army. Approved. Tony Herrera was to be awarded the Soldier's Medal for Heroism, 55 years late. Keanu sat down, letter in hand, and closed his eyes. It wasn't about a ceremony, or closure, or even gratitude. It was about giving a man his name back, a name history forgot, but one that shaped his father's life, and by extension, his own. That weekend, Keanu got in his car and drove to Texas. He didn't tell Tony why, just said, "I'd love to see you again." And Tony, as always, replied with the kind of quiet dignity that only comes from a life lived with no need for applause. "Of course, I'll put the coffee on." The next day, Keanu drove along a quiet stretch of rural Texas highway, windows cracked just enough to let in the scent of oak and dust. The town had faded into a memory behind him, and now in its place were long stretches of open land, dotted by rusted fences and windmills that creaked like old knees in the breeze. His GPS had given up 5 miles ago, but Keanu wasn't lost. He had a scribbled paper in the glove box. Directions passed to him discreetly by a local veteran who simply said, "You'll know when you get there." He did. A gravel road turned off from the highway, barely wide enough for one car, weaving between fields until it ended at a weathered house nestled under 2 towering live oaks. It was modest, with chipped white paint, a sagging porch, and a screen door that flapped in the wind. But it was clean, tended, a place that told you someone still cared. Keanu stepped out, his boots crunching the gravel. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle anyone. Before he could knock, the door creaked open. Tony stood there in a gray flannel shirt, sleeves rolled, eyes calm but surprised. "Wasn't expecting a Hollywood visitor," he said with a half smile. "Figured you'd be halfway to California by now." Keanu returned the smile. "I couldn't leave without saying thank you properly." Tony gestured him in. The living room smelled of cedar and coffee. A small wood-burning stove glowed in the corner. On the mantel sat only 3 things: a folded American flag in a glass case, a sepia-toned photo of two boys in uniform, and a silver cross. "No one comes out here," Tony said as he disappeared into the kitchen. "But I always make coffee. Habit." Keanu stood, letting the silence wash over him. No awards, no medals, no signed photos, just quiet shelves lined with books on history, philosophy, and war. Some spines cracked, some spines pristine, all read with care. Tony returned with 2 mugs. "Hope you don't mind instant." "I'm just honored to share it with you," Keanu said. They sat, sipping quietly, the warmth of the coffee settling the room into a stillness that spoke louder than words. Keanu studied the photograph again. Tony and his younger brother, side by side in uniform, both smiling like the world hadn't yet broken them. Tony caught him looking. "He didn't make it home," he said softly, "but he wrote me every day until he couldn't." Keanu lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry." Tony shook his head. "We all carried someone. That was my turn." Tony leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the walls, as if still looking over his shoulder in a jungle half a world away. His voice, low and steady, didn't crack when he spoke, but the pauses between sentences, those carried the weight. "I came back to this place after the war," he said, "not because it felt like home, just because it was the only place that hadn't changed." Keanu sipped his coffee slowly, letting Tony lead. "You never married?" Tony shook his head once. "Didn't think I could ask someone to live with a man who didn't sleep through the night. There were a couple chances, but I always pulled away before they could see the mess." Keanu nodded, absorbing every word. "But you stayed connected. The other men, from your squad?" "They're gone, one by one. Some from cancer, a couple from addiction, one... He just couldn't carry the weight anymore." Tony looked down into his mug, then set it gently on the table like it might break if handled wrong. "That's what they never prepare you for. Not the war part. The silence after." The room went quiet again, the only sound the slow tick of a clock above the fireplace. Keanu finally said, "You did more than survive, Tony. You gave them a chance to come home. That matters." Tony nodded, though his eyes never lifted. "That's the thing about doing your job right," he said. "Most of the time, no one notices." He stood and motioned toward the back room. "You want to see something?" Keanu followed him down the hallway to a small room that could have been a study or maybe once was a child's bedroom. On one wall was a hand-built shelf with a few military photos, a pair of old boots, and a faded green jacket with patches barely holding their threads. Tony picked up a folded piece of cloth and handed it to Keanu. "Found this in my brother's footlocker after he died. He kept it all those years, never told me, just said one day I'd understand." Keanu unfolded it slowly. It was a hand-stitched American flag, small, clearly homemade, the kind a soldier might tuck into his shirt for luck. On the inside, written in barely legible ink, "To my brother, who always carried more than his share." Keanu held the cloth like a sacred object. He knew. Tony blinked fast, then turned away. Doesn't mean much now." Keanu's voice was firm. "It means everything." They stood in silence, 2 men bound by a story neither one had expected to share. One built not on headlines or heroism, but on presence, pain, and quiet honor. Keanu stayed a while longer, asking nothing more, just being there. The sun dipped low through the window blinds, casting soft lines across Tony's face. He looked older in the fading light, not from age, but from the years of carrying memories alone. "Do you ever talk about it with anyone?" Keanu finally asked. Tony shrugged. "Sometimes, at the VA. There's a few old boys who come by. We talk more about knees and prescriptions than we do about Nam." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's something." Tony gave a soft laugh. "Yeah, it's something." They stepped onto the porch as evening settled over the quiet neighborhood. The breeze carried the smell of cut grass and distant barbecue. For a moment, it felt like peace. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Tony. "What's this?" "Something I brought from California," Keanu said. "It's not much." Tony opened it carefully. Inside was a simple wooden carving, a replica of the photo frame he had shown Keanu earlier, with the same 5 circled men, their names etched along the edge. It was handcrafted, smooth to the touch. "I had it made by a veteran artist in San Pedro," Keanu said. "He lost his brother too, said it helped to carve their names into something real." Tony stared at it for a long moment, then traced each name with his fingertip. "I didn't expect any of this," he said quietly. "I know," Keanu replied. "You didn't ask for anything. That's what makes it all matter even more." Tony nodded, eyes misting. "Funny thing is, I don't miss the war, but I do miss the feeling, the purpose, knowing every step mattered." "It still does," Keanu said. "Even here, even now." A pause. "You know," Tony added, "sometimes I think God leaves us behind for a reason, even if it takes a lifetime to figure out why." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's make sure yours is known." As they stood together, the porch light flicked on automatically, illuminating the small wooden frame in Tony's hands. And in that soft glow, it became clear. This wasn't just a visit. It was the beginning of something long overdue. Keanu sat in his quiet study, the photograph of Tony's squad in front of him, the names beneath it etched in fading ink. He couldn't shake the thought. How many lives had been preserved by a man the world never knew? He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found one buried under old labels. Colin J. Matheson, USO Tour, 2017. The man had retired 3 years ago, but Keanu remembered his strength, his integrity, and his unwavering devotion to veterans. If anyone could help verify Tony Herrera's story, it was Matheson. The call connected after 3 rings. "Reeves," Matheson's voice was deep, slightly hoarse. "Didn't think I'd be hearing from you." Keanu kept it short, respectful. He shared Tony's story, what he saw, what he heard, and what he'd confirmed from his father's letters. Then there was silence on the other end, then a low sigh. "Send me everything, I'll check the archives, but listen," the colonel said. "These things, they get messy when they're late. Bureaucracy hates ghosts." "I don't care if it's messy," Keanu replied. "He deserves to be seen." Within 2 days, Keanu received a secure email, scanned reports from 1969, witness statements from field medics, and a typed debriefing that mentioned a PFC Herrera who disobeyed retreat orders to pull 5 wounded to safety, no medals, no ceremony, just a single sentence. It wasn't enough for Congress, but it was enough for people who understood. Keanu contacted a veteran liaison, someone he'd met on set years ago, who now worked for a nonprofit that lobbied for recognition of overlooked heroes. They worked quietly, carefully. Keanu requested no press, no public appearances. This wasn't about Keanu Reeves. It was about a man who never asked for thanks and had gone his whole life without hearing it. Late one evening, the liaison called. "There's a workaround," he said. "He won't get the Medal of Honor, too many blocks, but we can secure a Distinguished Service Cross, quietly, privately, but it'll be real, and it'll be his." Keanu felt something settle in his chest. Relief. And something else. Reverence. He asked for the medal to be delivered to his address. Not to ship it, not to hand it off. He wanted to be the one who gave it to Tony, not in a crowd, not on a stage. Just man to man. He ordered a wooden display box, lined with velvet, custom engraving on the inside. For courage no one saw, but no one forgot. Keanu kept the metal box wrapped in a soft cloth, tucked carefully into a leather satchel he hadn't used since a trip to Japan. Every time he glanced at it, a mix of emotion welled inside him. Respect, sorrow, anticipation. It felt like holding something sacred, not because of the medal itself, but because of what it finally acknowledged. Before making the trip back to Tony's town, Keanu made one more call, to the widow of one of the men saved that day. Her name was Martha Lane, and she lived in Arkansas. She'd been 22 when her husband, Corporal Dean Lane, shipped off. Her voice trembled on the phone. "I never knew who saved him, just that he was never the same after Vietnam, and that someone carried him through jungle fire." Keanu told her it was Tony, that he was still alive, still humble, still forgotten by too many. She cried. "You thank him for me? Tell him Dean didn't get many more years, but the ones he did, he held our son in his arms." The moment sat with Keanu like a quiet ache. These weren't just war stories. They were decades of breath, laughter, sorrow, and silence, made possible by one man's decision not to run. He drove back to Texas alone, no assistant, no camera crew, just him, the satchel, and the heaviness of what he was about to deliver. Tony's house looked the same, simple, weathered, set beneath a large pecan tree that cast a heavy afternoon shadow. The wind rustled the leaves, as if even nature knew something solemn was about to happen. Keanu parked by the curb and walked slowly to the porch. Tony was there, just like last time, rocking gently, sipping black coffee from a chipped cup. He looked up. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon," Tony said, his tone flat but his eyes curious. Keanu smiled gently. "I wanted to bring you something." Tony gestured to the second chair. "You brought yourself, that's plenty." Keanu sat beside him, waited a beat, then carefully placed the satchel on the small table between them. Tony raised an eyebrow, but didn't speak. Keanu slowly opened the flap, pulled out the wooden box, and turned it toward Tony. He didn't open it, he just let it rest there. Tony stared at it like it was something ancient, something impossible. "What's that?" he finally asked. Keanu spoke softly. "Something that should have found you 50 years ago." Tony didn't reach for it. He just looked at Keanu, then the box, then back again. "Why?" Keanu's voice was steady. "Because I know the story now, and someone needed to say, 'We remember.'" Tony slowly reached out. His weathered hands hovered over the box like it might disappear. Then, with the gentleness of a man unaccustomed to receiving anything, he lifted the lid. Inside was the Distinguished Service Cross. Tony's breath hitched. His eyes didn't blink. He looked down at the medal, the silver cross, the laurel wreath, the blue and red ribbon, and said nothing for a long time. I don't deserve this," he finally whispered. Keanu nodded softly. "That's what makes you the kind of man who does." Tony shook his head. "I didn't do anything special, just tried to get my guys home." "And you did," Keanu said. "5 of them." Tony looked away. His jaw tightened, and his voice cracked when he finally said, "But not all of them." Keanu placed a small envelope next to the box. "This is from someone else, Martha Lane. Her husband was one of the 5. She wanted you to know that because of you, he came back. He held his baby. He got to be a father." Tony's fingers trembled as he touched the envelope, but he didn't open it right away. His chest heaved slightly. "No one ever said anything. All these years, I figured it didn't matter." Keanu leaned back in the creaking chair beside him. "It mattered to her, it mattered to them, and it matters to me." The wind picked up again. Leaves scraped across the porch like applause held back for decades. The pecan tree groaned softly, as if releasing something old and long buried. Tony didn't speak again for several minutes. He just held the medal in his lap, stared into the horizon, and let the silence speak for him. Finally, in a voice that barely broke the quiet, he said, "I thought that part of my life was gone." Keanu smiled faintly. "It never left. It was just waiting to be seen." Tony reached out and shook Keanu's hand, firm, weathered, and without ceremony. Just 2 men connected by legacy, one carried through the jungle by courage, the other through life by a story he hadn't known was his. "I don't know what to say," Tony murmured. "You already said it," Keanu replied. 50 years ago? When you didn't walk away." And with that, they sat side by side on the porch, the sun dipping low over Texas fields. No cameras, no stage, just one man who never asked for recognition and another who knew the power of giving it. The box had been in Keanu's possession for years. It sat in a corner of his storage closet in Los Angeles, sealed and labeled in his mother's handwriting, Gerard's letters 19681973. Keanu had never opened it. Maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe some part of him feared what he'd find, who his father was before the drinking, before the long absences and strained phone calls. But now, after everything Tony had told him, something urged Keanu to finally lift the lid. The old cardboard flaps peeled back with a quiet crackle. Inside were rubber-banded stacks of worn envelopes, yellowed paper, and Polaroid photographs, some of his father in uniform, others of men smiling in jungles or crouching in mud. There was a photo, freshly familiar. 5 men leaned on each other, soaked, grinning. One looked just like the man who had sat beside Keanu on the porch a week earlier, Tony Herrera. Keanu thumbed through the letters until he found one dated March 23, 1969, sent from a field hospital in Da Nang. The handwriting was rough, shaky. He opened it with care. "Dear Mom," it began. "You won't believe it, but I'm still here." The letter was gritty, filled with scattered thoughts, like a man trying to get something out before it slipped away. But one line froze Keanu mid-breath. "I don't even know his name, just a kid, maybe 20, pulled me out of the muck when I couldn't move, carried me over his shoulder, dodged fire like he had angels walking beside him." Keanu read it again. "I don't even know his name." There was no mention of Tony, no unit designation, just the raw testimony of a soldier trying to process a miracle. Keanu sat down slowly on the floor, back against the wall. The room around him blurred. He remembered moments with his father that never made sense, pauses in conversation when Keanu asked about the war, those rare nights when Gerard would get misty-eyed but never explain why. This was the reason. A stranger had saved him, a ghost who had lived all these years in silence. But not anymore. Keanu folded the letter carefully, pressed it against his chest for a moment, then slid it into his pocket. He rose, crossed the room, and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. He began writing a letter of his own. This one wasn't from a soldier. It wasn't even from a son. It was from a man who finally understood what it meant to be carried through time by someone else's courage. And he knew exactly who it was for. Keanu's pen moved slowly across the page. Each word felt like it carried the weight of 2 generations, his father's and now his own. He didn't try to make it formal. He didn't rehearse or revise. This wasn't a script. This was truth, finally spoken aloud. "Dear Tony," he began, "my name is Keanu Reeves. We met at the veteran ceremony in Belton. I was the quiet guy in the black baseball cap who couldn't stop looking at the photo in your lap." He paused, swallowing a breath, then continued. "You told me about what happened in 1969, about the men you helped, the ones who made it home because you wouldn't leave them behind. I didn't say it then because I wasn't sure, but I know now. My father was one of them. Gerard Reeves." The name seemed to tremble on the page. "I never told me the whole story, just fragments. A jungle, a firefight, a guy he never knew by name who pulled him out of hell. That guy was you?" Keanu looked down at the page, the ink smudged in one corner by a stray teardrop. He kept writing. "You saved my father's life, and whether you know it or not, that means you saved mine, too. Because of you, I got to grow up with a man who tried, even when he was broken. I got to become something because someone once carried my father when he couldn't carry himself." He paused. The silence in the room pressed close. "I don't know how to thank you, but I believe you deserve to be seen, to be honored, not by medals or spotlights, but by truth, by presence, by a world that owes you more than it ever gave." Keanu signed it with his full name, no titles, no mention of fame, just a son writing to a man who had changed the course of his family story. He slid the letter into a cream-colored envelope. He didn't seal it yet. Instead, he sat with it for a long time. Later that day, he made a call to the military nonprofit in Texas, the same group that had invited him to the ceremony. He asked for their help delivering something personal. No press, no stage. Just one man handing another the words he should have received decades ago. By nightfall, he had the letter packed in a small box, along with a framed copy of Gerard's note and the jungle photo Tony had shared. He didn't add anything else. He didn't need to. Tony heard the knock at his door late the next morning. It wasn't loud or hurried, just steady, polite, almost hesitant. He shuffled to the door with his cane, unsure of who it might be. When he opened it, no one was there. Just a small package on the stoop. He picked it up, brow furrowed, and carried it inside. No return label, no markings, just his name written in careful handwriting on the front. Inside was a letter, neatly folded, and a framed photo. He sat down at the table before opening it. His hands were slow now, not because of age, but because of feeling. Something inside him already knew this wasn't ordinary. He opened the letter. As he read Keanu's words, Tony's breath caught in his throat. His lips moved silently with each line, as if repeating them would help him believe they were real. The mention of Gerard Reeves made his hands tremble. He remembered the name, not the face, but the blood, the screams, the weight of that soldier's body on his back as he carried him through mud and gunfire for hours. The voice that had whispered, "I've got a son," before passing out. He remembered that part clearly. Tony looked at the framed photo next. It was the squad from Vietnam. His own photo, somehow reprinted and restored. But now, circled in red, was Gerard Reeves. Next to it was a note in a different handwriting. He recognized it, Gerard's. "I didn't get his name, but I owe him everything." Tony laid the letter down, pressed his palm flat over it. For the first time in years, tears didn't just slide down, they came. Hard. Not from sadness, but from something deeper, something long buried. He hadn't spoken about that day in detail for over 40 years. Not when he came home. Not at the VA. Not even to the few friends who'd stuck around. He'd buried it, like the others, like so many did. But now, here was a man, Gerard's son, reaching back across time to pull him out from silence. Tony sat for a long time, staring at the letter, rereading it. Then he stood up. He walked slowly to the small wooden box on his bookshelf, where he kept the only medals he'd ever received: service, campaign, and unit ribbons. He opened the lid, folded the new letter carefully, and placed it inside. Then he closed the lid and whispered, "That's the only medal I ever wanted." Outside, the sky was overcast. But inside, for the first time in a long while, Tony Herrera felt seen. It came in an ordinary brown box, no ribbons, no announcement, just a government seal and a return address from Washington, D.C. Keanu held it in his hands with an unexpected weight, heavier than the medal itself. Inside was a distinguished service cross, carefully nested in black velvet, with a folded certificate bearing Tony Herrera's name. The words on the paper were official, but the meaning? They were personal and long overdue. He didn't tell anyone, not his assistant, not a publicist, not the press. There would be no photos, no headlines. This wasn't about Keanu. It wasn't about fame or even justice. It was about a man who walked through hell, saved lives, and never once raised his hand for credit. Keanu flew commercial to Texas. No entourage, just a duffel bag in the box, safely wrapped in his carry-on. He rented a small SUV and made the 2-hour drive to Tony's town himself, the medal resting quietly in the passenger seat. He didn't play music. He needed the silence to think. As he pulled up to Tony's modest house, he felt his chest tighten. The screen door creaked as he approached. He paused, then knocked. It took a moment, but eventually, Tony opened the door, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, just like the first time they met. He looked surprised, but not unsettled. "Didn't expect company," Tony said, raising an eyebrow. Keanu nodded. "I've got something for you." Tony stepped aside, letting him in. The same scent of coffee and old paper filled the space. The same picture of the young soldier squad sat on the mantel. Keanu sat down and gently placed the box on the table between them. He didn't speak right away. He just let the moment breathe. Tony looked at the box, then at Keanu. "What is this?" "Open it," Keanu said softly. Tony flipped the lid. For a second, he didn't react. Then his breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened and his hand shook slightly as he reached for the medal. "Is this?" Keanu nodded. "It's yours, official. Signed, sealed, and delivered." Tony didn't speak. His lips parted, then closed again. His eyes welled, but the tears didn't fall. He set the medal down and ran a hand across his face, as if confirming it was real. "Davey, don't just hand these out," Tony whispered. "I never filed a report." "You didn't have to," Keanu said. They finally listened. Tony sat down slowly. His gaze never left the medal. I thought the world forgot." Keanu looked at him with quiet intensity. "It didn't. I didn't." Tony didn't answer, but his silence said everything. Tony reached for the medal again, this time holding it like it was something sacred. Not because it was shiny or adorned with prestige, but because of what it represented. The weight of lives saved, the years passed in silence, the burden of never telling his story. Until now. He ran a thumb along the edge of the medal's cross, his voice low. They always gave those to the officers, guys with rank, not to grunts who just got lucky. Keanu didn't interrupt. Tony shook his head. "I wasn't trained to lead. That day in '69, I wasn't thinking about medals. I was thinking about breathing, about getting those boys out of there alive." "You did," Keanu said gently. "All 5. Tony's eyes flicked to him. "Even Gerard Reeves?" Keanu nodded. "He was my father." Tony froze. His hand lowered from the medal. "No, he talked about you," Keanu added. "He didn't know your name, just called you the kid who wouldn't leave a man behind. Said you had eyes like steel and legs that never gave up." Tony leaned back in his chair, the air suddenly heavier. "Your old man? I carried him on my back for hours, thought he was going to bleed out." "You didn't let him," Keanu said. "And if you hadn't, there's a good chance I wouldn't be sitting here." The words hung between them like smoke. Tony stared at Keanu for a long while, the quiet kind of stare men share when they recognize something eternal in each other. "I didn't know," Tony said. Keanu nodded. "Now you do." Tony's voice was raspy now. "What made you do this?" Keanu hesitated. "You changed the course of my life before I was ever born. You saved the man who raised me. I've done a lot of things in this world, but I've never had the chance to repay a debt like that." Tony's hands cradled the medal again, but he looked at Keanu. "This means more than I can say. But this ain't about a medal." "No," Keanu agreed. "It's about being seen." Tony looked away for a moment, then back. "I never asked for a spotlight." "And I never offered one," Keanu replied. "Only a thank you." That made Tony smile, faint and honest, the kind that comes when pain finally meets peace. He rose from his chair slowly, as if the moment required something more than words. Then, quietly, Tony lifted his hand in a slow, steady salute. Keanu stood, chest tight, and returned it. No cameras, no crowd. Just one man saluting another in the still of a Texas afternoon. Keanu stayed a while longer. The sun had dipped low in the Texas sky, casting long shadows across Tony's porch. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. Tony brought out 2 glasses of sweet tea, poured from a dented thermos. Keanu accepted his without a word. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Full of years, full of sacrifice, full of everything that had gone unseen for far too long. "You know," Tony said at last, "I used to think that part of my life didn't count, that it was just something I survived, and surviving didn't feel like something to be proud of." Keanu looked at him. "But it is." Tony gave a quiet laugh. "Guess I just needed someone to say it." "You earned every inch of this," Keanu said, nodding toward the open metal box. "And then some." A breeze rustled through the old wind chimes above the door. Inside, a small radio played the gentle crooning of a country ballad, something from another era. Tony tapped his fingers on the armrest in rhythm, eyes lost in the horizon. "Think I'll hang it by the photo," he said, meaning the medal. "You should," Keanu replied, "and write your name on the back of the frame." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" "So no one forgets," Keanu said. "Not again." Tony nodded slowly. The truth of that settled deep in his bones. They parted not with a handshake, but with a simple look, an acknowledgement of something lasting, something that went far beyond awards or names in books. Before Keanu left, he turned at the end of the path and saw Tony still sitting there, the medal resting on his chest, one hand placed over it like a heartbeat. And in that quiet, sacred moment, Keanu understood something. Sometimes the loudest honors are the ones given in silence. And sometimes the bravest men are the ones who never ask to be remembered, only to be believed. The Texas sky was painted in quiet gold when Keanu pulled up to Tony's house. There were no flashing cameras, no handlers or limos, just a dusty rental car and a package resting gently on the passenger seat. He'd made the drive alone, all the way from Los Angeles. No entourage, no press, just him, a mission, and a promise he didn't have to make. Tony answered the door slowly. His body moved like a man twice his age, shoulders slightly hunched, knees stiff from years of crouching in foxholes and pouring concrete. He hadn't expected company, but when he saw Keanu standing there, holding a small wooden box against his chest, he instinctively stepped back. "Can I come in?" Keanu asked softly. Tony nodded and held the screen door open. He didn't speak. His eyes flicked toward the box, but didn't ask about it. They sat on the same porch where they'd first spoken, in the same worn chairs. The breeze tugged at the wind chimes above them, casting a soft, hollow tune into the quiet. For a moment, neither man said anything. Then Keanu set the box on the small table between them. "I have something for you," he said. Tony's brow furrowed. "Son, if this is about what we talked about..." "It is," Keanu interrupted gently, "but it's not what you think." He reached down and opened the box slowly, revealing the Distinguished Service Cross. The metal glowed against its dark velvet bed. Red, white, and blue ribbon, perfectly folded. The bronze cross, pristine and heavy. Tony blinked. His body didn't move. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, as if bracing for an explosion. "Read it," Keanu said. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the envelope inside the box. The words were formal, typed on crisp government letterhead, signed by the Secretary of the Army. But Keanu didn't read it like a speech. He read it like it was scripture. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy of the United States in the Republic of Vietnam. Tony looked away. Keanu kept reading, his voice steady, anchored in reverence. Specialist 4th Class Antonio Herrera, without regard for his own safety, braved heavy enemy fire to extract 5 wounded soldiers, crossing 2 miles of hostile terrain, saving lives under impossible conditions. The silence between the sentences stretched like a sacred rope. The words didn't just describe an event. They revealed a truth long buried. Tony slowly turned his head back toward the box. He stared at the metal like it was something he couldn't touch, something that belonged to a man he used to be. "I don't understand," he finally said. "Why now?" Keanu folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Then he looked Tony in the eye. "Because some men don't ask for honor," he said, voice low. but they deserve to wear it. Tony's lips parted, but nothing came. He looked at the box again, then at Keanu, and the wall he had built over decades finally cracked. Tony reached out with both hands, slow and trembling, and lifted the Distinguished Service Cross from its velvet bed like it was made of glass. He didn't speak. His fingers traced the edges of the metal, lingering on the engraved stars, the weight of it grounding him in a moment that didn't feel real. His shoulders began to shake. Keanu didn't say a word. He let the silence do the speaking, the breeze carry what needed no sound. Tony looked up, eyes glassy, and for a moment the decades dropped away. He wasn't an old man with a bad hip and a pension. He was 20 years old again, boots soaked in jungle water, dragging wounded brothers through the mud, not knowing if he'd survive another hour. He closed his hand around the metal and held it to his chest. "I didn't think anyone remembered," he whispered. "I do," Keanu said. Tony's face crumpled. He looked away, ashamed of the tears, but they came anyway. He pressed the metal tighter to his chest and began to weep. Not the quiet kind, but the deep, ragged sobs of a man who had waited too long to be seen. Tears that didn't come from grief, but from release. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're not alone anymore." Tony wiped his face with the back of his sleeve and gave a shaky laugh. "All these years, I thought I was just background. The guy who made it home, but didn't matter." "You mattered," Keanu said. "To every man you saved, and to one you didn't even know." Tony turned, puzzled. Keanu reached into his coat pocket and handed Tony a folded letter. "From my father. He never stopped talking about the man who pulled him out of that jungle. He never knew your name, but I do now." Tony took the letter like it was a lifeline. He didn't open it, not yet. He just held it, like he already knew what it would say. Then, slowly, he stood. Keanu stood with him. The old soldier placed the metal back in its box, then closed it gently. He looked at Keanu, really looked, and offered a quiet nod of understanding. Of brotherhood. No more words needed to be said. They stood facing each other, back straight, eyes locked. And then, in a gesture older than both of them, Tony raised his hand to his brow in a slow, perfect salute. Keanu returned it, his own eyes wet. In that moment, no stage, no press conference, no fanfare could have said more. They stood in silence, two men bound not by time, but by something deeper. Shared respect, unspoken reverence. Keanu slowly lowered his hand after the salute, his voice hushed. "Some people fight to be seen. Others spend their whole lives hiding. You didn't ask for this medal, Tony, but it's always been yours." Tony gently placed the letter and the medal back into the wooden box. Then he sat down on the edge of his porch with a long sigh. "I spent so many years thinking silence was strength, that if I kept the pain locked up, maybe it would stop echoing." Keanu sat beside him, the Texas sun dipping low behind them. "But silence doesn't mean healing," he said. "Sometimes it just means no one's listening yet." Tony nodded slowly. "I didn't think anyone would care." "I care," Keanu said simply. "Because you didn't just save a group of men. You shaped the life of someone who wasn't even born yet. Without you, my father wouldn't have made it back. And without him, I wouldn't be here." Tony swallowed hard. "I never had kids of my own," he murmured. "But it means something. To know someone I helped has a son who remembers." He glanced at the box again. "I don't know what to do with this." "Whatever feels right," Keanu replied. "Keep it or bury it, but don't hide from it anymore." Tony leaned back, staring into the horizon. "I think I'll hang it on the wall, right beside my brother's photo. He didn't come home, but maybe now a part of him finally can." They sat there as dusk fell, the sky turning amber, the cicadas starting to hum. No cameras, no headlines, just a quiet porch, a box with a medal, and a conversation 50 years overdue. Keanu finally stood. "I'll come visit again." Tony looked up, a ghost of a smile on his weathered face. "Next time, I'll cook." Keanu chuckled. "Only if it's better than my mac and cheese." Tony laughed, the sound full and real. "Deal." As Keanu walked toward his car, Tony called out behind him, "Hey." He turned. "Thank you, not for the medal, for listening." Keanu nodded. It was an honor. And as the car pulled away into the long Texas road, Tony stood on his porch holding the box. Not because he needed to, but because for the first time in decades, he felt like he truly belonged to the story he lived. The VFW hall was nothing fancy, just a squat, weather-worn brick building nestled beside a tire shop and an old diner in a Texas town barely big enough to show up on most maps. The sign out front was faded, the American flag overhead a little frayed at the edges. But inside, something sacred stirred. Keanu pulled into the gravel parking lot just after sunrise. He stepped out quietly, holding a small black box in one hand, a folded sheet of paper tucked in his inner coat pocket. No entourage, no flashbulbs, just stillness. This wasn't about fanfare. Inside, rows of metal folding chairs had been set up facing a modest wooden podium. The air smelled faintly of coffee, old varnish, and years of stories that had soaked into the walls. About 30 people filled the room. Many were older veterans, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes or sitting upright, with chests still proud beneath wrinkled button-downs. A few younger faces dotted the crowd, children, grandchildren, a young couple holding hands, and 2 active-duty Marines in dress blues standing near the back. Near the far wall, Tony Herrera sat quietly by himself. He wore a neatly pressed blazer over a pale blue shirt. His boots were scuffed but polished. In his lap, he held a flat brown envelope, fingers gently resting on it like it was something fragile. His eyes scanned the room, never resting too long on any one face. He looked like a man trying to make himself small, even in a room built to honor him. Keanu approached from behind and gently patted Tony on the shoulder. Tony looked up, offered a small, wordless nod. No conversation, just understanding. At exactly 10 a.m., a young Marine named Sergeant Dean Walker stepped to the podium. His haircut was fresh, his back straight. He wore his ribbons with quiet pride, but spoke with humble reverence. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "Today we gather not for ceremony, but for correction. Because some stories deserve the light, and some men deserve to be seen." The room stilled. "This is about Specialist 4th Class Anthony Herrera," Walker continued. "A man who, in 1969, during a brutal ambush in Vietnam, carried 5 wounded soldiers to safety while under direct enemy fire. He was wounded himself, refused medical evacuation, and never filed a report." Tony stared at the floor. His only statement, recorded later, was this: "I just did what anyone would have done. But we know better. Not everyone would have risked their life for others. Not everyone would have gone back, again and again, until every man was accounted for." Walker looked at Tony, then stepped aside. Keanu inhaled slowly. It was time. Keanu stepped forward, slowly, his eyes never leaving Tony's. The small black box still rested in his hand, the folded letter now gently pinched between 2 fingers. He paused at the podium, not behind it, but beside it. "I'm not a soldier," Keanu began, his voice low, steady. "I've played one in films. I've trained with people who've worn the uniform, but I've never served. So, I speak here today not as someone who understands what you've lived, but as someone who deeply respects it." He turned toward Tony. "I met this man at a small ceremony not unlike this one. He didn't speak much. He wasn't in line to receive anything. He was in the back, watching, carrying a photo, not for show, but for memory." Keanu unfolded the letter slowly. "My father, Gerard Reeves, was in Vietnam. He never talked about it, except once. He told me there was a man, a stranger, who pulled him out of a jungle when he was bleeding too badly to stand. He said he never saw him again. He looked up, until I sat beside him in Texas. A quiet gasp rippled through the room. Keanu stepped closer to Tony. "Sir, your actions didn't just save 5 lives. You saved futures, families. You saved my father, and in many ways, you gave me the chance to be here today." He held up the letter, his own handwriting now trembling in his hands. "I wrote this to try and express what words can't." Tony's hands shook as he accepted the letter. Keanu turned to the black box, opening it slowly. "This," he said, "is the Distinguished Service Cross. It comes too late and with far too little noise, but it comes from a nation that owes you more than silence." He held it out, not like a presentation, but like a gift being returned to its rightful owner. Tony reached forward. His fingers hesitated at the edge of the box, then curled around the metal's ribbon. His chest rose sharply with breath. His eyes glistened, but no tears fell yet. For a long moment he didn't say a word. He just stared at the metal. And then he stood. Every veteran in the room rose with him. No command given, just respect, rising like a wave. Keanu took a step back, letting the moment belong to the man who had once done the same for others, without ever asking for anything in return. Tony slowly turned to face the room, no longer a man sitting in the shadows, but one standing in the full weight of his history. He nodded once, humbly, as if unsure what to do with all the eyes on him. Then, softly, he cleared his throat. "I didn't do anything special," he said. His voice was gravel and quiet thunder. "I just brought my brothers home." Someone in the front, an older veteran with a cane, tapped it once against the floor in quiet applause. Another followed, then another, until the room filled with the soft rhythm of respect. Tony looked down at the medal, cradled now against his chest. "I never thought I'd wear anything like this, and I don't need to. But I'll keep it, for the boys who didn't come back, for the ones who did and were never the same." He paused, then added, "And for Gerard Reeves. I didn't know his boy would grow up to be this man." He looked at Keanu. "But I'm damn glad he did." Keanu, standing at the edge of the crowd, placed a hand over his heart. No words were needed. The moment said everything. The ceremony continued in silence. No more speeches, just handshakes, hugs, salutes. Afterward, they shared sandwiches and coffee in the hall's back room. Old stories filled the air, some light, some heavy. Laughter came slow, but real. Tony sat near the window, holding the folded letter from Keanu like a compass he wasn't ready to set down. Later, when the crowd thinned, Keanu returned to his side. "Can I ask you something?" Keanu said. Tony glanced over. "Sure. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? File the report? Ask for something?" Tony's lips curved into a soft, tired smile. "Because when you're out there, you're not thinking about medals. You're thinking about keeping someone breathing. That's the job." Keanu nodded. "I get that," he said. "But it was never just a job. What you did, what you gave, deserved to be remembered." Tony chuckled. "Well, it was, by you. And that's more than enough." The two men sat there for a while, no more words between them, just the silence of understanding. As dusk began to fall outside the hall, Keanu looked once more at the medal pinned to Tony's chest. It shimmered gold against the old man's simple brown jacket. Not for cameras, not for credit, just for truth. And finally, for honor. The chairs were being folded and stacked when she approached. The VFW hall had grown quieter, the buzz of the modest celebration dimming into private conversations and handshakes. Tony Herrera stood beside the table, gently tracing the edges of the medal now pinned to his chest. His fingers trembled, not from age, but from disbelief that it was real. She hesitated at first, standing a few steps away. Keanu noticed her, mid-30s, gentle but nervous, holding a folded envelope in her hand like it might fly away. She cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Hera?" Tony turned, surprised to still be addressed by that name. Most people just called him Sir or Tony. His eyes landed on her face. There was something familiar about it, though he couldn't place it. "My name is Rachel Grayson," she said. "I don't expect you to know me, but I'm the daughter of Corporal David Grayson." Tony blinked. She nodded, her voice thickening. "The man you carried through the trees in Vietnam, the one with shrapnel in his leg. You stayed with him all night until the medevac arrived." "That's my dad." For a long moment, Tony didn't say anything. He just stared at her, like she was a dream stitched from threads of memory. Finally, he whispered, "David had a daughter?" Rachel smiled, tears pooling in her eyes. "He passed away a few years ago, but he told me about you. Said he never got your name, just that an angel with grit and a rifle saved him when the jungle tried to swallow him whole." Tony chuckled faintly, the sound more air than voice. He was a good man. She said, "and he became a great father, because you gave him the chance." Tony's mouth opened, but no words came out. Rachel stepped forward and handed him the envelope. "This is from him. He wrote it years ago. He just never knew where to send it." With shaking hands, Tony opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of yellowed paper, worn at the folds. The handwriting was rough but sincere. He scanned the first few lines, his lips parting, eyes glistening. "I never knew your name," it read, "but I want you to know mine. I want you to know what you did mattered. I held my daughter for the first time because of you." Keanu had wandered near during the exchange, quietly observing. He watched as Tony held the letter close to his chest, overwhelmed. Rachel reached for her purse and pulled out a photograph. "This is my son," she said. "His name is Tony. We named him after the man we thought we'd never find." Tony looked down at the photo of a smiling boy with messy brown hair and a mischievous grin. His knees buckled slightly. Keanu stepped in just behind him, steadying him with a hand on his back. Tony whispered, "He looks just like your father." Rachel wiped her eyes. "And hopefully one day, he'll carry your strength too." Tony stepped outside for air, the photograph of the boy still in his hand. The night had settled in softly, blanketing the quiet Texas town in a hush of stars. Streetlights cast golden halos onto the pavement, and the hum of cicadas filled the space between his heartbeat and his breath. Rachel joined him a moment later, standing beside him in silence. She didn't press. She didn't speak. She just stood there, like family does when there are no words, but the heart still needs company. "I never thought I'd see this day," Tony finally said, voice low. "I never wanted medals or speeches. I just wanted to do my job and come home. But for the longest time, I didn't even know why I made it out when others didn't." Rachel looked at him, her voice a whisper. "Maybe you made it so we could." Tony nodded slowly, the truth of her words settling deeper than any honor could reach. "Your dad, he was bleeding out fast. I remember thinking if I'd just got him to that ridge, maybe, just maybe someone would hear us." She smiled. "He told me that. Said he woke up in the chopper and the only thing he remembered was your face over him and the sound of you saying, 'Stay with me.'" Tony rubbed his eyes. "I haven't thought about that day in decades. It was always easier to forget." Rachel tilted her head gently. "But remembering brought us here." Behind them, the lights of the hall still glowed softly. Inside, Keanu sat at a table, speaking quietly with one of the veterans who'd served alongside Tony, but his eyes kept flicking toward the door, checking on Tony like a brother who understood that sometimes the real battles come after the war. Tony took a deep breath and looked down at the photo again. "He's got strong eyes, your boy. He'll do good in the world." Rachel's eyes sparkled with tears. "He already has, because I get to tell him about you now, about the man who didn't walk away." A long silence passed between them. Not empty, full of decades of stories untold, gratitude unspoken, and legacy passed down without fanfare. Rachel reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. "I wanted to give you something," she said. Tony opened the small box she placed in his hand. Inside was a silver dog tag on a chain, freshly engraved. It read, "Tony Herrera, hero unwritten but never forgotten." Tony blinked hard, fighting the emotion rising up. "I don't deserve this." "You do," she said, "because someone finally said it out loud." Behind them, Keanu stood now at the door, arms crossed, watching the moment unfold from a respectful distance. He said nothing, just nodded, slowly, deeply. Tony looked out at the quiet street, then at the night sky. "Maybe it's not too late," he said softly. Rachel smiled. "It's never too late when someone remembers." Tony walked Rachel to her car in silence. She held his arm like a daughter would. Familiar, natural, as if the decades between them had never existed. The wind stirred slightly, carrying the scent of mesquite and wild sage through the lot. Under the soft glow of the street lamp, Rachel opened her car door, then turned back to him. "Will you stay in touch?" she asked. Tony hesitated, not from doubt, but awe. After so many years of isolation, a question like that felt foreign, but he smiled and nodded. "I'd like that." She slipped into the car and started the engine. Before driving off, she rolled the window down and said, "His name's Tony, because my dad said heroes should be remembered in full, not just for what they did, but for who they are." Tony watched her drive away, the red taillights fading into the dark. For a long time, he didn't move. The wind whispered across the empty street like a voice from the past saying, "You're not done yet." Behind him, Keanu stepped outside. His jacket was off, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He stood beside Tony and offered him a quiet nod. "She's special," Keanu said. Tony gave a small chuckle. "Yeah. Her father, he was just a kid when we got hit. I didn't know if he'd make it. He was the smallest one in the unit, but he kept trying to stand, even with a bullet in his leg." Keanu looked down, voice thick. "He talked about you. Not by name, but always said there was one man who made sure he got to come home." Tony turned, brow raised. "He did?" Keanu nodded. "That man was you, my father, was Gerard Reeves." For a moment, Tony just stared, blinking slowly as the realization hit him all over again. Only deeper. "Your father..." Keanu swallowed the emotion rising in his throat. "He told me someone carried him when he couldn't walk. Someone who didn't leave him behind. I always thought it was just a story. Until I met you." Tony looked out toward the horizon. "I guess none of us knew what that moment would become." Keanu stepped forward and put a hand on his shoulder. "Because of you, I got a father. Even if I lost him too soon, I got years I wouldn't have had. That matters." Tony didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the engraved tag Rachel had given him. He stared at it for a moment, then pressed it into Keanu's hand. "I want your nephew to have this. Or your son, someone down the line. Not for me, but so they know what it means to stand for something quiet." Keanu looked down at the tag, then at Tony. "Then I'll make sure it's passed on." They stood together as the stars came out. Two men bound by blood, not their own. Not by war, but by what followed. And for the first time in years, Tony didn't feel like a ghost. The sky over the Texas plains was soft with dawn, a faint pink hue spilling across the horizon like a quiet promise. The air held that in-between stillness, when the world hasn't yet woken, but peace already walks among the tall grass. Keanu sat on the old wooden bench at the edge of the ranch property. He had come early, before the sun had fully risen, not out of impatience, but reverence. He was waiting for Tony. When the screen door creaked open behind him, he didn't turn. He didn't need to. The footsteps were slow, careful, but steady. Tony Herrera moved like a man with history in his bones. Some of it painful, some of it sacred. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into old jeans and boots that had seen more miles than most men would ever walk. Around his neck, tucked beneath the collar, The Distinguished Service Cross still hung, worn now like second skin. Tony sat beside Keanu without a word, settling into the silence like it was something earned. For a long stretch of time, neither spoke. They watched the horizon change colors. Pale gold met soft indigo, shadows faded, life returned to the land. It wasn't until the first rays of light touched the hills that Tony finally broke the quiet. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said, eyes still on the sunrise. "I know," Keanu replied. "That's why I had to." Tony gave a soft, tired laugh. "You sound like your old man." Keanu looked down at his hands, folding and unfolding slowly. "He used to talk about you, not by name, just the idea of someone who stayed behind when it would have been easier to run. Said he owed everything to a ghost in the jungle." Tony nodded. "I didn't need thanks. Not then, not now." "I know," Keanu said gently, "but someone did need to say it." Another pause. Another breath of wind passed through the grass. Tony reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled out the old letter Keanu had given him, the one written by Gerard Reeves decades earlier. The paper was yellowing, corners creased, ink faded in places. He held it like it was something holy. Tony didn't read the letter aloud. He didn't have to. He had already memorized every word. The trembling in his fingers wasn't from age. It was something else entirely. A weight lifted, but also felt. Keanu watched him in quiet respect, giving the moment the room it deserved. He knew that for men like Tony, silence often said more than speeches ever could. After a while, Tony finally spoke, his voice gravelly and low. "I used to think about them," he said, "the ones who didn't come home. I used to wonder what their families were like, what kind of people they became. Never knew I'd meet the son of one." "You didn't just meet him," Keanu said softly. "You shaped him. I wouldn't be who I am without my dad, and he wouldn't have made it if not for you." Tony gave a small nod. He looked out at the vast stretch of land in front of them, as if searching for something. Maybe the past, maybe peace. "I've been sitting on porches and benches like this for a long time," Tony said, "waiting for something to feel right. Never knew it'd be this." Keanu smiled gently. "Neither did I." The wind picked up a little, stirring the wild grass and sending a ripple across the field. Birds moved through the trees in the distance. The world was waking up around them, but here on the bench, it still felt suspended in time. Tony folded the letter and tucked it back into his pocket. "I always thought," he said, "if I had to be remembered, I'd rather it be for something quiet. Not a statue, not a headline. Just someone saying, 'He didn't walk away.'" Keanu turned to him. "Then you got your wish, because I'll remember you for that. And I'll make sure others do too." They both looked straight ahead again, the sun now cresting the distant ridge. Golden light spilled over the hills and lit up the tops of the mesquite trees. It bathed them in a gentle glow that felt like a blessing. Tony's eyes misted, but he didn't look away. "Funny," he said after a while. "All these years, I thought I was invisible. Turns out I was just waiting for someone to look long enough." Keanu nodded, his voice soft. "And now that someone has." They sat in that stillness, shoulder to shoulder. No more words needed between them. Minutes passed, or maybe more. Neither man checked a watch. There was no schedule, no rush, no destination they needed to reach. Just this moment, sacred in its simplicity. Keanu finally broke the silence with a question, not forced, not heavy, just honest. "Do you ever think about going back? Not to war, I mean, but to the stories? Writing them down?" Tony chuckled under his breath. "You mean become one of those old guys who writes a memoir nobody reads?" "I'd read it," Keanu said. "And I know a few million others who might too." Tony didn't answer right away. He looked down at the letter from Gerard Reeves again, still folded carefully in his lap. "I used to think that if I said it out loud," he murmured, "the pain would come back. The guilt. Survivors carry more than memories, Keanu. We carry ghosts." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. then maybe the only way to honor those ghosts is to let others know who they were. Tony nodded slowly. Maybe someday. Maybe when it hurts a little less. They sat a while longer, until the sun had fully broken free from the horizon. It cast long shadows behind them. Tony shifted slightly and took a deep breath, as if the air itself tasted different. Then he turned to Keanu with a wry smile. "You always this philosophical at sunrise?" Keanu laughed. "Only when I'm sitting next to a man who deserves the whole world's gratitude." Tony leaned back, gazing upward, letting the sky wash over him. "I don't need the world," he said, "just needed to know I wasn't forgotten." "You never were," Keanu replied. "You were just waiting to be found." The breeze blew again, warm now, carrying with it the scent of dust and mesquite and wild grass. In that moment, everything felt as it should be. Two men, one bench, a letter, a medal, and a history that finally had its witness. As they stood to leave, Tony paused, one hand gripping the armrest, the other still clutching Gerard's letter. His knees creaked, but his spirit didn't. He looked out one last time at the land he'd come to know so well. Then, quietly, he said, "Let's go. I've got something worth waking up for now." Keanu smiled. "I'll drive." And together they walked back toward the truck. No fanfare, no headlines, just purpose. Just two men, one who had once saved a life, and one who finally returned the favor. The morning after their bench conversation, Tony returned home to a mailbox overflowing with envelopes. At first, he assumed it was junk mail, but when he opened the first envelope and saw the return address, Veterans Affairs, Denver, his hand paused. Inside was a letter from a man who had never met him, but had read about him in an anonymous write-up titled "The Quiet Hero of Huntsville." The story had appeared in a small-town paper 2 days prior, published without Tony's name but filled with the truth of his bravery. A local journalist who'd attended the VFW ceremony had written it after being moved to tears. The article had been quietly picked up by regional news, then spread across veteran forums online. From there, it took on a life of its own. Each envelope in Tony's hands now held words he never expected to read. "Because of you, my grandfather came home. You carried more than men, you carried generations. My son is named after someone you'll never meet, but today I know his name should have been yours." Tony sat at his kitchen table, slowly opening each one. Tears tracked down the creases of his weathered face. He didn't cry often, not for himself, but this wasn't about him. It was about a past that no longer had to stay buried. Word traveled fast in the veteran community. Retired officers from battalions across the country began contacting the VFW hall in Huntsville. Some remembered stories, some had old rosters. One man sent in a faded photo from 1969. In the background, half obscured, was Tony's helmet tilted back, carrying another man over his shoulder. For the first time in decades, someone other than Keanu was looking backward for the sake of looking forward. Tony didn't want attention, but now he understood something deeper. Maybe the point wasn't about medals or headlines. Maybe it was about giving others permission to speak. Men who had lived too long in silence, carrying burdens no one saw. That afternoon, Keanu arrived with another envelope, this one in his own handwriting. "I know how you feel about spotlights," Keanu said softly, "but I was thinking, what if the spotlight could help someone else out there, still waiting to be seen?" Tony nodded. He understood. Inside was a proposal, written not in Hollywood script but in simple font. A scholarship fund, not in Keanu's name, not even in Tony's, just in honor of the quiet ones who carried us. "For children of forgotten veterans," the tagline read. Tony pressed the paper to his chest, closed his eyes, and whispered the names of men who never made it home. Then he signed the bottom of the form. Not for himself, for them, for the ones who never got to see what came after the jungle. The scholarship fund launched quietly, just as Tony preferred. Keanu worked behind the scenes with the military foundation to ensure every dollar went directly to families in need, children of veterans who had slipped through the cracks of history, paperwork, and memory. They called it the Quiet Valor Grant, and Tony's signature was printed on the first round of certificates. A few weeks later, a small community college in El Paso sent a thank you video. A young woman, maybe 20, stood in front of the camera holding back tears. Her father had served in Afghanistan, returned with PTSD, and passed away before she finished high school. "This helped me register for my nursing program," she said. "He didn't leave a lot behind, but now I carry him forward." Tony watched the clip 3 times, then turned off the laptop and just sat there. The silence in his kitchen no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like reverence. Letters kept arriving, from young soldiers and old-timers alike. One came from a former Marine who'd read the article and hadn't spoken about Vietnam in 50 years. "You helped me remember who I was before the ghosts took over," it said. "I thought I was alone in this silence. Turns out, I wasn't." Keanu came by one evening just as Tony was sorting through the letters. He brought 2 mugs of coffee and a folded piece of paper. "You've got a guest next week," Keanu said with a smile. "Someone who found you through the story." Tony looked puzzled. "Her name is Mia," Keanu continued. "She's a teacher in Colorado. Her father was one of the 5 you saved." Tony's hands trembled as he unfolded the note. Inside was a short message from Mia. "I never got to thank the man who gave me my dad. I'll be in Huntsville on Saturday if you'll let me stop by." Tony stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he nodded and slid it carefully into the stack of letters, right beside the one from Keanu's father. The day Mia arrived, Tony wore his nicest shirt, a pale blue button-up that hung loose on his frame. He met her at the gate with shaky hands, unsure of what to say. But Mia knew. She hugged him tight and whispered, "You gave me everything I have." Later, they sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree in his backyard. Mia showed him photos. Weddings, birthdays, grandkids. "All of this exists because of one man in the jungle who wouldn't let my dad die." Tony said nothing for a long time. Then he quietly asked, "Would you tell your children I said hello?" Mia smiled and nodded. "They already know your name." Later that week, Keanu returned with something wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Tony without a word. Inside was a framed print of the article, "The Quiet Hero of Huntsville." The edges were signed, not by celebrities, but by veterans who had read the piece and written their names in honor of the man who inspired them to speak again. Some were simple. "Semper Fi, brother." Others longer. "I never got my welcome home, but reading about you made me feel like I finally had one." Tony didn't hang it on the wall. He placed it on the mantel, beside the Distinguished Service Cross and a photo of the 5 young men he'd led out of the jungle. In that row of faces, one of them, second from the left, was Gerard Reeves. That night, Tony stepped out onto his porch and looked up at the stars. The Texas sky was wide and open, full of silence that didn't hurt anymore. He lit a candle and placed it beside a small wooden box he kept by the door. In it were the letters, the article, and a folded copy of Keanu's handwritten note. Across the country, the Quiet Valor Scholarship started appearing on more college aid websites. Stories of Tony's heroism filtered through veterans groups, inspiring men and women to speak up for each other, often for the first time in years. Tony never sought attention, but he accepted what came with a humble heart, knowing it wasn't about medals or applause, it was about connection. The thread between generations, between strangers and survivors, between silence and healing. In one letter, a widow of a Vietnam veteran wrote, "My husband never told me much about what happened over there, but when I read your story, I saw pieces of him in your words. Thank you for helping me understand him better. Even now." Tony kept that letter by his bed. On the following Memorial Day, Keanu was asked to speak at a national veterans event. He declined the spotlight. Instead, he submitted a quote that was read aloud. "Not all heroes come home to parades. Some come home to quiet roads and quiet pain. But when they give without expecting anything in return, they leave behind something more powerful than recognition. They leave behind a legacy." The camera panned to Tony sitting quietly in the audience. He didn't stand, he didn't wave, but when the room rose in applause, he pressed one hand gently over his heart, and that was enough. Tony didn't want attention. He never sought out recognition, but something inside him shifted after the ceremony. It wasn't pride or vanity, it was peace. The kind that settles into a man's bones after decades of silence. Keanu could see it in the way Tony walked now. Shoulders not straighter, but lighter. Weeks passed, then months. Tony began visiting the local high school, not to speak at assemblies, but to sit in the back of classrooms during history lessons. The first time, the teacher didn't even realize who he was. But a student raised their hand and asked about the framed article pinned on the hallway bulletin board. The anonymous story, titled "The Quiet Hero of Huntsville." "That's him," another student whispered, pointing at Tony. Tony gave a small wave. A few days later, the teacher asked if he might be willing to speak to the class. "I'm not much for speeches," Tony said quietly, "but I can tell you what honor feels like." He spoke softly. No dramatics, no medals on display, just stories of service, of sacrifice, of men who never made it home, and those who did, but left parts of themselves behind. And the students listened, really listened. The school invited him back, then another school did, then a small community college. Word spread without headlines. Veterans in surrounding counties began calling him for coffee, asking to sit and talk. Tony always made time. Keanu kept his visits low-key. Every year he returned to Huntsville around the same time, never announced, never followed by press. He and Tony would meet at the same bench near the VFW, drink black coffee, and sit in silence. Sometimes they talked about Keanu's films, sometimes they talked about Tony's garden, but most often, they didn't talk at all. They didn't need to. One autumn morning, Keanu arrived at his home in the canyon. A crisp breeze carried the scent of pine and the memory of Texas dust. On his porch sat a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. No return address, just a folded note on top. Keanu opened it slowly. The handwriting was steady, etched in blue ink. "For the one who remembered the forgotten. Thank you, brother." Inside the box was a single silver coin, worn but still gleaming, and a folded American flag, neatly pressed, its stars facing upward. Beneath the fabric, tucked gently at the bottom, was a photo. Tony, much younger, standing with a group of soldiers in the Vietnam jungle. Gerard Reeves circled in red. Tony circled too. Keanu clutched the flag, eyes stinging. Then he smiled. Tony had always said he didn't need recognition. But sometimes the greatest salute isn't a medal, or even applause. It's being remembered without asking. Keanu held the coin between his fingers for a long while. It was the kind of coin soldiers carried, a challenge coin, often passed from one warrior to another as a quiet nod of respect. No ceremony, no spotlight, just a token between those who had seen something most never would. On one side was an eagle, wings spread. On the other, the words, "For service beyond self." Keanu had seen medals, he had seen trophies and awards, plaques with polished edges and gold lettering, but this felt different. It wasn't given to impress, it was given to connect. And he knew immediately that Tony hadn't given this to anyone else before. Later that week, Keanu called the VFW in Huntsville. The man on the phone, a fellow veteran named Charlie, grew quiet when Keanu asked about Tony. "We haven't seen him this week," Charlie said. "But that's not unusual. He goes out to the cemetery sometimes, brings coffee, sits with the names." Keanu smiled softly. That sounded like Tony. But then Charlie added, "His house is still lit at night. Porch light always on. He's still here." Keanu made plans to visit again. When he returned to Texas, the first thing he noticed was a new plaque just outside the VFW entrance. It was small, modest, but powerful. In honor of Staff Sergeant Antonio Herrera, for bravery that asked nothing in return. Beneath the text was a single photo, the same one from the ceremony. Tony standing, shoulders squared, head slightly bowed, the Distinguished Service Cross on his chest, the only time it had ever been worn. Inside the hall, things were quiet. A small group of local veterans sat around a table, sipping coffee and playing cards. One looked up, recognized Keanu, and nodded toward the back. "He's in the library," the man said. Keanu walked down the hallway, past old photos of units and battlefields, past shadow boxes filled with medals and names. He found Tony sitting in the library, alone, flipping through a binder filled with letters. Handwritten ones, typed ones. Some came from veterans, others from children. But all had one thing in common. They were addressed to him. Some said, "Thank you for your service." Others simply said, "Thank you for remembering." Tony looked up as Keanu entered and grinned like he was expecting him all along. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Tony said. Keanu pulled out the folded flag from his coat. "Came to return something," he said. Tony shook his head. "It was never mine to begin with. I just carried it for a while." Keanu sat down across from him. Two men, two generations, one bond. And in the stillness of that quiet library, it was clear that something far greater than gratitude had been exchanged. Legacy, not built in bronze, but in lives touched, stories shared, and hearts healed. Later that afternoon, Keanu and Tony stepped out into the Texas sun, walking side by side down the old path behind the VFW hall. The wind swept over the plains, rustling the dry grass like waves on a golden sea. There was a wooden bench just outside the fence line, overlooking a small grove of oak trees. Tony sat slowly, easing himself down, knees creaking beneath him. Keanu didn't speak, he just sat beside him. After a long silence, Tony reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn, folded sheet of paper. "I want you to have this," he said quietly. Keanu unfolded it. It was a list, names written in fading ink, one beneath the other. "They were the boys I pulled out that night," Tony said. "I used to read their names on tough days. Reminded me they were worth every scar." Keanu traced a finger down the list. Near the bottom, Gerard Reeves. "My father," he whispered. Tony nodded. "He was the one who couldn't walk. Took two of us to carry him out, but he kept yelling for us to leave him and go." Keanu's eyes welled. He'd heard that part of the story. He just hadn't known who was on the other end. "Did he make it?" Tony asked softly. "And did," Keanu replied. He didn't always talk about it, but when he did, he called the man who saved him a ghost with fire in his eyes. Said, "You looked like you were running toward the bullets, not away." Tony chuckled, then coughed. "Maybe I was, or maybe I was just too scared to stop moving." They both laughed, quiet, from the belly. And then they just sat again, watching the wind roll by. Before Keanu left, Tony stood slowly and offered something he hadn't given anyone in decades. A salute. Sharp, steady, silent. Keanu returned it, hand to brow, no words exchanged, just eyes locked. Two men connected by courage, by sacrifice, by bloodlines crossed in the shadows of history. When Keanu finally turned to go, Tony called out, "Hey." Keanu stopped. "You remembered the forgotten," Tony said. "That matters more than anything." Keanu nodded once. "And you gave us something to remember." That night, Keanu returned to LA, but he carried more than a letter, more than a coin. He carried a story now, not one of heroes in movies, but of real ones, who lived quietly, gave completely, and asked for nothing but to be remembered. And in a small town in Texas, under an open sky, a man named Tony Herrera lived the rest of his days with one truth finally heard. He had mattered, and someone finally had said so. Some heroes walk through history unnoticed. No headlines, no parades, no standing ovations, just quiet footsteps, echoing in the hearts of those lucky enough to be saved by them. Tony Herrera never asked to be remembered. He didn't wear his sacrifice like a badge. He wore it like a scar. Deep, unseen, and earned. But every nation, every community, and every family needs someone to remember the ones who held the line when no one was looking. The ones who didn't fight for glory, but for the man beside them. The ones who came home with stories locked behind tired eyes, photos folded in wallets, and names whispered to no one. This incredible story didn't begin with Keanu Reeves. It began in the jungles of Vietnam, in a moment of chaos, where a 19-year-old kid named Tony made a choice to carry wounded men on his back through gunfire and smoke, because it was the right thing to do. Because someone had to. Because honor doesn't wait for permission. That act should have made headlines, but instead Tony faded into the background of civilian life, like so many others. Decades passed, the medal never came, the world moved on. But memory, true memory, doesn't need a stage. It needs someone to look long enough. Keanu Reeves didn't show up for recognition. He didn't bring cameras or agents. He brought his presence, his humility, his ears, and his heart. And when he found out that Tony had saved his own father, he didn't see it as a coincidence. He saw it as a calling. Because sometimes the greatest gift we can give isn't money or fame. It's dignity. It's telling someone, I see you. It's writing the letter they never received. It's showing up at their door not with applause, but with silence. A silence that says, you didn't need to shout to be heard. This incredible story is not just about medals or war or even Keanu. It's about remembrance. It's about how one man's life rippled outward, quietly shaping generations through the soldier he saved, the family that soldier built, and the son who never forgot his father's stories. That ripple became a wave. Tony's medal wasn't just forged in metal. It was forged in sweat, sacrifice, and the hands of those who refused to let silence be the final chapter. At the small VFW hall in Texas, Tony finally stood under the soft glow of honor, not from Hollywood, not from politics, but from truth. From a lifetime of service that asked for nothing and gave everything. And maybe that's what makes this story so incredible. Because in a world full of noise, Tony Herrera never raised his voice. He simply kept going. And finally, someone noticed. Keanu Reeves gave Tony something irreplaceable: acknowledgement. And in doing so, he reminded all of us what real legacy looks like. It's not trophies or social media likes. It's not trending hashtags or front-page stories. It's in the quiet mentor who never quit on his brothers. It's in the folded flag left as a gift. It's in a silver coin carried through war and passed down with reverence. It's in the voice of a granddaughter saying, "You gave us generations." Tony's life will never be forgotten now, not because Keanu made it public, but because he made it personal. And maybe you're watching this wondering, does it matter? It does. Because somewhere out there, another veteran sits in silence, wondering if anyone remembers. A teacher wonders if their words changed anything. A nurse hopes the long night shift meant something. A single father questions if he's doing enough. And the answer is yes. Yes, it matters. Yes, you are seen. Yes, your life counts even when the world is too busy to say so. This incredible story is your reminder. You don't need a camera to be a hero. You don't need applause to make a difference. You just need to keep showing up, keep giving, and keep believing that one day someone will look back long enough to say, I remember. So, if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who gave quietly, if you believe that dignity still matters, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Not just for Tony, not just for Keanu, but for the next story that's waiting to be heard. Because someone out there, maybe someone you know, is still waiting to be remembered too. Let's be the ones who remember. Let's be the ones who say, "You mattered," and we won't forget.